Hello, my name is Fabrice DeClerck. I'm the Science Director at EAT and also a Principal Scientist with the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Both of these centers are part of the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, or the CGIR. What I want to talk to you about today is really about the central role that food plays in planetary scale implications for environment and for health. What I want to start with is recognize as society we've tipped into a new global era, a new geological era even, that we call the Anthropocene. What's significant about the Anthropocene is that we've now reached a point where human actions have passed local in terms of impact and have become planetary at scale. Our actions today are going to be part of the permanent geological record. What's critical about this is that decisions that we make collectively as society, both individually and collectively, particularly around food, are going to have significant impact on environmental sustainability as well as on human health. What foods we eat, how we produce them, where we produce them, how much we consume, how much we lose and waste, all of these are going to have significant impact on planetary scale environmental variables. It's also really important to recognize that this transition to planetary scale impact means that we can no longer talk about localized impacts or one-off challenges. This next chapter of human existence will require pluralistic solutions, addressing food security and environmental security, and water security and livelihood security. The either-or solutions that we may have been comfortable with in the past are no longer fit for purpose given the scale of challenges that we're facing. Becoming comfortable with working with these multiple challenges is at once a critical responsibility for science. There will not be any single solution that we can scale for massive impact. Rather, we must think about approaches that can enable a diversity of solutions to collectively scale for impact. And science provides, I think, the critical frameworks to enable this multi-level decision-making, contributing both the data and the evidence, not to define the solution, but to support many localized solutions that are responsive to diverse contexts. These frameworks also are going to help us anticipate the consequences of pursuing different paths. I like to use a cream-filled cookie to describe this concept. I realize it's not a good definition for those of us interested in health, but it works for demonstrating the purpose and illustrating the point. The top layer of that cookie, the hard cookie, represents a dietary boundary for how much food overall, what foods and what amounts each of us would need to consume or should consume in order to live a lifestyle that's free of dietary risk. Evidence suggests with a high level of certainty that plant-rich diets that include diversity of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, with optional modest consumption of meat and dairy promote low risk of chronic disease overall and promote overall dietary health. This figure from the globe-borne disease that you see here speaks to which risks have the greatest responsibility in terms of mortality and trivial diet. What I want you to see here is that number one is a diet high in sodium. So reducing sodium intake is a global challenge. But look at the values that are below that. A diet low in whole grains is number two. A diet low in fruits is number three. A diet low in nuts and seeds is number four. And a diet low in vegetables is number five. And so on. We see that low in seafood, low in fiber, low in healthy fats, low in legumes, and at the end we get to diets that are high in processed meat, low in milk, and high in red meat. So what this tells us is that low dietary diversity is a major challenge for multiple forms of malnutrition. Focusing on healthy diets, what we did with the Atlantic Commission was suggest that we should all have access to sufficient food, 2,500 kilocalories per day on average for everyone globally, and that we should be distributing these foods across a diversity of food groups that reflect the best evidence for what constitutes a healthy diet. This Eat Lancet Planetary Health diet, or what we call the reference diet, allows for great flexibility because the dietary elements shown here are compatible with a wide variety of foods, agricultural systems, cultural traditions, and individual dietary preferences. These diets can be combined in various types: omnivore, vegan, vegetarian diets, high income, low income. Let's now return to the cookie. If the top of the cookie is a healthy diet, The bottom of the cookie represents the planetary boundaries for food that we shouldn't exceed if we want to stay within a safe operating space for climate, biodiversity, and environment. Different food groups have different impacts on the environment. Animal source foods are responsible for 3/4 of climate change effects, food-based climate change effects, whereas staple crops such as wheat, rice, and other cereals are responsible for 1/3 to half the pressures on other environmental domains. The Atlantic Commission's definition of sustainable food production stays within safe planetary boundaries for 6 environmental processes that together regulate the state of the Earth system. These are climate change, land use system change, freshwater use, biodiversity loss, and interference with the global nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Healthy diets and sustainable food production are 2 hard biophysical boundaries. There's little that we can do about adjusting these boundaries. They're what it means to be biological, a human being, to live on a biological or living planet. From a dietary point of view, they are what we require as biological beings for health and to mitigate the risk of diet-related disease. And from the environmental side, they define the safe environmental space within which humanity can survive. Science has a really critical role to play in describing these boundaries and using them in a way that enables society to navigate a transition to healthy, safe, and sustainable futures. Let's go back to that cookie. You see that cream fill in the middle? That's the malleable part. These are the social choices, the decisions that we make as a society, the economic policies, the behavior decisions that we make every day in terms of what food we eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, if we're lucky to have those options. Decisions that we make both individually and collectively. And ultimately, these will define whether or not we can stay within a safe space. Science can't prescribe which of these decisions we must follow. That's a social choice. But it can help us to understand what the consequences of the choices are on health, sustainability, and equity. The challenge that we find in communicating the Lancet Planetary Health Diet is that it's sometimes misinterpreted as a top-down imposition on society. We hear questions like, well, what do these guidelines mean in terms of cultural preferences? What do they mean in terms of flexibility and choice? Substitutions and significant flexibility are possible, including massive diversity in cultural and personal preferences within the ranges of healthy and sustainable. This additional figure from the Global Burden Disease collaborators looks at what dietary recommendations might look like by region. We can describe what a universal healthy diet is, definition, but there are non-uniform trajectories to achieving this. You can see in this figure that the recommendation is indicated by the green bar that's aligned vertically across each of these bar graphs. And you can see the countries or the regions as the rows, these bars on the left-hand side, and then 5 different food groups. What you see, particularly from this figure, is that for red meat on the far left, is that the patterns of consumption are not universal. There are regions, particularly in high-income regions, where we need to significantly reduce red meat consumption. But there's also regions, particularly in Africa, where increasing meat consumption might have a positive health impact. There still is a universal recommendation for healthy diet, but again, the trajectories are not uniform. If we're aiming to eat or consume animal source proteins within these recommended ranges, then the biggest challenge we find when we look at this globally is that we know what a healthy diet is, but we're not consuming what that recommendation is. This figure, unlike the first one, looks at health-promoting foods like fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. Here again, you can see that there are important regional differences, but compared to the meat figure, there's almost universal underconsumption of fruits, almost universal underconsumption of vegetables, maybe a great distribution of legume, beans, and pulse consumptions, particularly in Latin America and Africa, where there's a common tradition of consuming plant-based proteins, and a global or universal underconsumption of whole grains and universal underconsumption of nuts and seeds. There's significant scope to increase the consumption and production of these beneficial food groups and to celebrate the tremendous diversity, cultural and biological that they represent. I think that we're missing a major opportunity to really communicate that, yeah, there's a critical challenge to reduce overconsumption of animal source proteins, but there's also a significant opportunity and maybe a more positive message to increase the consumption of this diversity of protected foods. With so many foods being underconsumed globally, we need to elevate the diversity of foods that can contribute positively to these dietary needs, especially when considering how to balance healthy diets with sustainable food production systems that keep us within a safe operating space across planetary boundaries. But the big question remains, well, which foods? Here I think the role of science shifts from describing boundaries to helping to uncover potential solutions. There's a real value in emphasizing food diversity. Look at the nutritional composition of a wide range of foods to understand their value in terms of iron, folate, vitamin C, vitamin A, calories, protein, etc. All too often, however, we're seeking the one food within each group to amplify that superfood that we're all looking for. But a better option might be to focus on the diversity of foods that make nutritional contribution, recognizing their diversity of cultural, socioeconomic, and environmental context that we're confronted with, and really celebrating this diversity. This allows us to do a couple of things that I think are major differences from how we're currently focusing on agricultural research for development. One, if we gain a better understanding of the nutritional contribution of foods across the globe, we'll better be able to see which foods are common across different cultures. Rather than promoting a food that's foreign to help meet the population's nutritional needs, we could promote the food that's already in that culture, already in that region, and work on improving its productivity and its accessibility. We can also group these foods that have very similar nutritional profiles but very different agroecologies. And instead of trying to adapt a crop to the local environment, we can ask ourselves what crop with nutritional profile I'm interested in is best suited for the environment that I'm working in, or in the culture that I'm working in. What are local traditional foods in this environment that are currently underutilized? We can also encourage consumption of foods that align with healthy dietary patterns and cultural preferences, but have lower environmental footprints, and encourage more sustainable methods of producing these culturally relevant foods. So understanding how this diversity is distributed in nutritional, agroecological, and cultural spaces allows us to better leverage the diversity of foods as a major solution space to provide healthy and nutritious diets and more sustainably produced foods that fit within cultural understandings. We have a major opportunity. Science has a critical role in providing clear guardrails for global action, allowing people to make decisions that are framed within the evidence of what is healthy and sustainable. But within these guardrails, we can seek the diversity of local solutions, the collaborations with local partners that enable us to transition to healthy, safe, sustainable, and I would also add equitable futures.